Chapter 11, Industry, Key Issue 4, Content Objective. Explain why industrial site and situation factors are changing. ICANN statement number 1. Describe the changing situational factors for steel production. 2. Explain the emergence of newly industrialized countries and the global shift of industrial production through changes in site and situational factors. 3. Explain the site and situational factors for textile production in the world. 4. Explain the site and situational factors to maquiladoras in industrial manufacturing, and then further explain why maquiladoras are unable to use just-in-time delivery methods for industrial production. Steel, changing inputs and changing outputs. When we look at steel, there are two changes in situational factors. In the United States, steel is not produced through integrated industrial production anymore. It is mostly outsourced, and really what we get are fabricated metal or some steel products is found in steel mills within major cities throughout the entire United States. We also see the changes in proximity to markets. So now often these steel mills will be located near those market areas, large urban areas throughout the United States. And the main reason for, again, these steel mills is because of access to ubiquitous metals and scrap metals. And then we begin to see the changing really in 1980, 81% of produced steel is produced in developed countries. And by 2016, now it declined by 35% in developed countries, which increased 65% in developing countries. So we see by the mid-19th century through the 20th century, steel mills were located near inputs. And then now in the mid-20th century, we have near markets where they have steel production in steel mills, which is commonly used with scrap metal. And then we import a lot of steel abroad because of cheap situational factors. The changing production really is, in the United States, steel production has changed several times. When we look at closer to the steel mills, we talk about one-fourth of U.S. steel. One-fourth of U.S. steel markets are captured through steel mini mills. And again, it's because of that scrap metal. And mini mills generally limited to one step of the process of the steel production. It's less expensive than integrated mills. So they've streamlined the process, and they've used ubiquitous scrap metal for steel production. Here we can look at integrated steel mills in the 1800s, the late 1800s, the mid-1800s and the late 1800s, and then moving into the 20th century with the early 1900s. In late 1900s. Don't forget, as we learned earlier, they eventually arrived in the Mesabi Range through the Great Lakes because of iron ore depletion through the eastern coast states, and then eventually finding iron ore in the Mesabi Range. But then again, we see in the 1950s the Mesabi Range closes. Again, when we look at the late 1900s, we're beginning to see most of our steel imported from abroad. Starting, which we'll talk about here in about 1980, and then that's when we see the shift to the steel mills, which you can see with the red dot there. With we can't see steel mills here. I'm sorry, the steel mini mills. But we'll begin to see moving away from the integrated steel mills to now mini steel mills. We've also seen a shift in the United States, a shift from what is now the Rust Belt, or seen as at one time the Iron Belt, which are these northern states, and many of them shifted or began to shift with right-to-work laws in the South. And right-to-work laws would establish open shop, meaning that in an open shop, a union in a company may not negotiate a contract that requires workers to join a union, and they also, within those right-to-work laws, they make it much more difficult for unions to organize factory workers, collect dues, and bargain, and fight for employees' rights and pensions, and also the strength for employees. Notice that right-to-work laws are not in Minnesota. However, we see right-to-work laws in many states. Again, diminishing the power of collective unions and the power of union workers, eliminating collective dues and abilities to bargain and ability to seek pensions, just pensions. So when we begin to see steel imported from abroad, we see the emergence of newly industrialized countries. Those newly industrialized countries will begin with steel production. The steel production, as I already mentioned, was found now with a 65% increase since the 1980s to 2016. We can see that in 2016, the steel's production, in this case, it says 73%. And again, we look at the largest decline in the United States. And the largest growth is in China's steel industry, which has grown in part because of the access to the primary inputs of iron and coal. So the mineral and the energy needed to produce steel. And also there's a principal factor because of in recent years there's been a demand for the growing cities in China, and they've consumed a lot of steels for infrastructure and motor vehicles. Here we look at the steel production in 2017. To the left is a choropleth map, and it shows that steel production is highest in China, as already mentioned. We can see in the U.S. still produces a fairly large amount of steel. However, as I already mentioned, it's mostly through mini mills. And then we can also see, looking at the developing regions over here, we can see them capturing almost 2/3 of the market of steel production. Here's another comparison of choropleth maps between 1980 and 2010. Again, 1980, we see steel production fairly high, above 100 million metric tons in the U.S. And then by 2010, it has dropped between 10 to 99 million metric tons. And again, the emergence of China and developing regions. Here we look at motor vehicles. Motor vehicles was discussed in our previous key issues. But when we look at motor vehicles, we can see that the production of motor vehicles follows situational factors. They're going to be found nearest Auto Alley. That's that alley that runs from Alabama to Michigan. It's going to be situated centrally, so access to the largest markets in the U.S. on both East and West Coast. We can also see the importance of outsourcing because of low wages in countries, which is a site factor to produce most parts that are used to put together and manufacture a vehicle in the U.S. Same goes within Europe. Most of the parts are made in the Eastern European countries, and they locate their manufacturing centers for vehicles in the East-West corridor that splits UK and Russia in the middle of each of those two regions of Europe. And then we see with China steel automobile production, which again we learned in previous key issues, is that they captured 30% of all automobile markets in the world currently, and they produce in the western area of China following arithmetic density urban populations. Here's a look at Auto Alley, and we can see the assembly and manufacturing plants located stretching from here we see Michigan and parts of southeast Canada, like areas of the Ontario province, all the way down to central Mexico. When we look at the automobile makers, what's a U.S. car? So 30% estimates are between 20 to 30%, depending on the brand. Ford and GM will say 30%. Some other cars, 20 to 30% will be the value of the assembly, and then 70% is the imported parts from outsourced cheap labor, and then also the situational factors. It's again cheaper to transport with break bulk appoint and with the cheap labor than to produce domestically. And then we can see again what with the 4 bases in Europe, and then in also East Asia, with the largest car manufacturer being in China. Here's a look at the assembly, what cars are assembled in the United States. So we see the Toyota Prius is, most of the Toyota Prius is not assembled in the United States. Most of that car is shipped to the United States. Then we can see brands that are closer to 100% North American parts. Here's a look at the east-west corridor in Europe. Again, it's situated between the East Europe and Western Europe. Here's a look at a modern assembly plant, very similar to the United States, where we find assembly plants one story, and they follow that the assembling process through steps that go on one end of the building and out the other along a major interstate corridor, usually a belt line of an urban area. But here we see in Europe, it's found in the suburbs where the low class typically resides, and they're near major interstates or roadways. Motor vehicle production, talked about. Here's a look at future cars and what's driving the electronic market. One Belt, One Road. Here we look at comparative advantages. A comparative advantage, which I mentioned, is the lower cost of labor, land, and capital. And that will decide on the location of a manufacturer. They'll move away from a high-cost location to a low-cost location, which results in a comparative advantage decision. Manufacturing factories in the U.S. With that comparative advantage have moved south because of right-to-work laws, or Mexico into maquiladoras. Here's working in a maquiladora. Take a minute to reflect on what you've learned. When we talk about maquiladoras are plants in Mexico near the U.S. border. They are more than 1 million documented Mexicans that are employed through 3,000 maquiladoras as of 2020. The advantage environmentalists complain about maquiladoras because it lacks quality or air and water quality standards or controls. And then again, these standards are less than what you would see in developed countries like the United States or Canada. And also the labor price, Mexican wages are still higher than China, but again, it's closer towards the auto alley, so situational factors. They use less break bulk or point modes of transportation, and then all the added expenses that go with break bulk or trade modes of transportation. And then we can also see it's not close enough for just-in-time delivery because it's too far to get the products for the assembly process in those plants that are located in the United States in rural areas. Right. Let's move on to site factors. When we look at site factors, we can look at, we're going to look at labor, and labor is the most important factor in the new, what is known as the new division of labor in our global supply chain. The new labor is going to be found in developing regions where they'll start out by producing textiles, and they'll be produced in large industries. They'll control a large portion of the textile trade. As we talked about with textiles, it's a labor-intensive industry. That means the higher percentage of the final product goes to the wages of the laborer. So most labor-intensive industries are found in less developed countries through outsourcing because the site factor is a cheap labor. It sets up this global supply chain that follows Wallerstein's economic systems theories. LDCs produce the textiles because of low-skilled manufacturing. Then they're consumed by core countries. And again, core countries will, in this supply chain, will offer new factories and new technology with the factories. Here we look at manufacturing wages, and we can again just revisit what we talked about. These are going to be capital-intensive wages, where they're using more technology and communication with higher skilled manufacturing jobs, such as like in IT or robotics, artificial intelligence. And then down here is going to be labor-intensive jobs, where they're going to be producing mostly textiles and low-skilled manufactured jobs. The other site factor we look at is capital. Capital is going to be the technology, and it can be factories, and it can be other infrastructure. When we look at site factors, when we look at capital factors, that can be the ability to borrow money to create new industrial expansions in developing countries. Think about agricultural industry, and the largest fertilizer and pesticide and herbicide multinational corporate producers, Monsanto. They have a lot of expansion of capital and technology. If they're producing textiles, remember they're not going to have much capital. They're going to be dependent on the core countries to supply those new factories and to supply the new technology. So when we look at textiles here in a second, we're going to see that the advancement of capital is very limited because it's dependent on core countries. Then we can also look at land, and land is going to be in our contemporary manufacturing plants found in more developed regions of the world where it's one-story buildings called industrial parks. So they're in an enclave within edge city or suburb city along the Beltline. They're out there because cheaper land and also because of access to truck transportation and markets to capture the most markets in an urban area. And then with land in less developed countries, large multinational corporations will offshore. So they'll set up their headquarters or they'll set up their manufacturing plants in cheap land in developing countries, but they'll run and operate and control that land, where again in developing countries have very little impact over land in manufacturing production. Here's a look at industrial parks in more developed regions. We can see site factors with textiles. And when we look at site factors for textiles, 90% of cotton is woven in either China or India. When we look at the process of textiles, textiles are women fabrics as well as apparel, clothing. They're labor-intensive jobs. There's three principal steps. You have your spinning, you have your weaving, and you have your assembly. Spinning and weaving are all labor-intensive jobs. So when we look at woven, we're looking at weaving. So spinning and weaving is going to be a labor-intensive job, and nearly 90% is found in India and China. Here's a look at the spinning process, which is the first process. That's spinning is when you're taking the fibers to make yarn. Spinning is usually the principal fiber you're going to use is cotton or synthetic cotton. It's 3/4 of the world's thread that's used. China and India, China controls 2/3 of cotton yarn is produced in China, whereas when we look at cotton thread in India is 1/5. Here's a look at production of women's blouses. We can see that assembly is not necessarily in less developed regions. Assembly can be in more developed regions, especially if it's specialized women's blouses, as we see right here in the United States. Where would they make women's blouses that are specialized? Yes, in the Southwest. And why in the Southwest? Cheaper site factors, immigrant workers that will work in the factories of garments, and in this case, women's blouses. Here's a look at the site factors in the flow chain, the global supply flow chain. When we look at the largest flows of clothing, it's from East and Southeast to Asia to North America and Europe, because they're, again, labor-intensive regions of the world. But remember, not all assembly is necessarily going to be found in less developed regions. For surely the spinning and weaving process will be found, because those are highly labor-intensive. Here's a look at clothing manufacture in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And they're making clothing for retailers in Europe and the United States. When we look at a garment, in this case a hoodie, we can see the offset of prices. When we look at the top hoodie, it's $38.10 it would cost to produce through the spinning, the weaving, the assembly, which includes the trim, and then the labor, and then the taxes, and then shipping. We can see that labor accounts for half of the price of or almost half of the price of a hoodie. Whereas when we look at the labor costs in Asia, it only amounts to $5 of the $31.40. So we see an offset of roughly $7 of making the hoodie in Asia and the United States. So again, that's that comparative advantage of why we would ship this hoodie, or why multinational corporations would ship this hoodie from China or an Asian country to the United States. All right, and if we have time in class, we'll watch that. Let's go to Weber's least cost theory. Firms will choose locations on multiple inputs with Weber's least cost theory. So his idea is now is you have two inputs. You have a manufacturing factory and then you have a market. So Weber's theory is just talking about minimizing the costs with multiple inputs. As you can see right here, you're going to let me just we have mountain springs and hops and grains. So the manufacturing plant's going to be located further away from the hops and grains because they're lighter in volume to transport. You can transport more than water. So the manufacturing would be closer to the water because it's heavier to transport. And then you would try to be equidistant from the market, in this case, Thirsty Town. This tells about Weber, and it says manufacturing would be located where cost is least. So cost is the most important factor with transportation and deciding a manufacturing plant location. Then they also want to locate in areas where there's non-union labor, so they go to right-to-work law countries or states in the United States. They also form agglomerations, which are groups of industries that mutually benefit one another. Example would be doctor offices near pharmacies and hospitals. Or they create agglomerations, and that's excessive agglomerations, like we see in the East Coast. And then we have vertical integration, which is manufacturing companies merge with other companies that want to link with supply and production. Those are key terms you'll have to know for the test. When we look at the site and situational factors, so site factors are the two inputs and the manufacturing plant, and then your last site factor would be the market. Situational factors are the distance between those inputs and where you put the manufacturing plant. All right, go ahead and review what was just discussed. And that will take us to the end of notes.